Good morning. I'm Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1230. But we're learning the Kuntres I wanted to finish what I began yesterday, where he explains the ideas that we're learning in Ayin Beis more elaborately. Namely, the difference between Chitzenius HaMeichin and Pnimius HaMeichin. So both are cognitive processes. They're both using the mind, but one focus is more on the result that the intellect. It's like when you learn something, like the difference is there's two ways of learning. It says, La sukkah shmaita liba de hilchasa. You're studying in order to derive what's the final psak, the ruling. And then there's Yagdul Teiriyadi. You're learning just to learn, to understand the idea. So similarly, only similarly, when Moichin is Shaykh Lemidus, so your study is primarily focused, like we learned, to bring out the middas, the result, the emotional reaction. What does it mean for me? In other words, is this good? Is this not good? Basically, its result is a subjective emotion, but it's guided by, not by impulse and not by subjectivity, but by a mind that's concentrated and understands well the subject. When you're talking Pnimius HaMeichin, you're talking about a level that is focused entirely on the subject itself. And paradoxically, is the Chitzenius HaMeichin that needs work to bring it into an emotion. Whereas in Pnimius HaMeichin, the emotions come automatically because you're so absorbed in the subject itself, like he said, in the etzem inyan eliki, in this case, we're talking about godliness, that it automatically creates middas that come naturally from that state. So you're also in a state of passion, but it's not a subjective nature. In other words, not like it's felt, murgish. It's almost like it's in many ways seamless. Is a good word I think would use in that context. So in Kuntres Aveda we've been learning to explain this. He's been talking about the steps, how you go through going another language that he used. At first you begin with levushe hasaga. In order to understand something, especially when you want to understand it and how it's relevant to you, the most important thing is that you have to have handles. You have to have a way to relate to it. Like we discussed yesterday at length, like you from Kuntres Aveda, that you use examples. Let's say you want to understand God's chesed, we have to look at our chesed. To understand divine attributes, we look at our attributes, at our faculties. So in that sense, that's Levushe Hasaga, that's Chitzenius HaMeichin. And then from there, you start stripping it from the very handles that we relate to understand the idea itself. And like he made it clear, not through shlila, not just to say God is not the way it is. It's understanding the idea, so to speak, without the mashal, without the example, without the application, without the personal relationship, the personal way of relating to it. It's literally like similarly as when you take a student and you move, you say, till now I've been giving you an example. Now we're going to talk about the subject without an example, the subject matter itself. So we've been learning, I'm going to try to finish today the Kuntres Aveda, all to explain these two stages in the bottom of page 1229 and top of 1230 in Ayin Beis, volume 3. How it's explained in Kuntres Aveda more in detail. There are more places in Chassidus that Rabbi Rashab himself explains this idea. I found the Maimer in Eter, Tafresh Ayin, also around the period of the Kuntres Aveda, 1910 approximately, where the Rebbe Rashab also talks about it. But and Kuntres Aveda is pretty elaborate, and I'll give you more sources if you want to look into it yourself. There's more places to look into. But so what we've been learning, I went yesterday through page 6, 7, and 8. And we're on page 8, the second paragraph of Kuntres Aveda. If you want to follow that, it's not on ayinbeis.com, has the Ayin Beis text. The text of the Kuntres Aveda we put on the WhatsApp group. Any of you, by the way, are listening who are not part of the group, just give us your number and name and we'll add you. because in the group we also post the audio of each day's class as well as different resources, and if there's any change in schedules, so it's a good place to just get updates about this daily class. Okay, so on page 8, I'm looking at Kuntres Aveda, page 7 and 8. So he went through this process. He said, Aveda Primis HaMeichin starts as be'etzem inyan halaki. He calls that Neshomo. There's many levels. And he began that first we go through Hasaga B'levushe Hasaga. And then he said, which means through garments, through handles, through the Hasaga has garments like regular garments that we're able to somewhat hold on to it and relate to it. Then he goes on and says, with examples and everything, that was good. At the bottom of page 7, and then he begins to negate and strip and put aside the things, the so-called the handles, the garments through which he understood the idea. He comes to understand the very core idea itself. Yeah. Just to use a secular example, like when you try to understand the subatomic stratosphere or the subatomic world domain, where we don't have physical instruments, and definitely not our physical eyes or our empirical tools, our sensory tools, to be able to see and witness an experiment, let's say, on that level. So many analogies are used, and things have to be understood through extrapolation. But when you are someone that's a beginner, you need to give a lot of examples, how to explain a microscopic world that's not visible to a microscope. Once you get through the examples and once you begin to, say, to master it, but at least someone who becomes more of an expert, they begin to understand the idea without all the examples. But if you hear any good physicist explain that, you'll see all kinds of examples they're giving. Physical examples to be able to understand things that are not so visible. Visible examples to understand the invisible. And then there's a point where you can talk about the subject matter itself. It's in its abstraction, obviously. That's what's mafshit. That's what it means to be mafshit to say. Okay. He also qualified that even in Chitzenis HaMeichin, you're still focusing on the godliness, because even if you're learning through examples or through Levush HaSoga, the point is still not to understand ourselves, it's to understand godliness through ourselves. So he made that qualification. I'm just summing up in my mind what we learned here. Well, not in my mind, in my words. And then there's the Etzem in Eliki. Okay. In the last line, he said it was not Yediyas Hashlila, which I explained. Okay. And after all this, so he's already moved now from Primi Chetzeni Samoichin to Primi Samoichin. He says, and after all this, so now he's going to add something that Ayin Beis doesn't say, but it helps us understand the subject better. He's going to add another step. He's going to show that even though you've now come to the very core of the idea, the divine idea, even though it's the level of neshama, which is equivalent to the level of muskal, of moichin, Ibr Yunika moichin, muskal, chabad, in the midas, the kol mokim einem meir b'ze etzem ha'er b'gili mamish. Nevertheless, you still don't have radiating in it the actual core oir. What he's going to explain now, that it's still somewhat ruach sheben neshama. And the reason why, he explains, because the lefisha bolaze ade levusha hasoge, since in the process of going from the bottom up, Remember, we began by understanding things on our terms. And from there, you're coming to understand the very core divine idea. So since you came to Levush HaSaga, even when you strip it and you like shed that layer, that garment, it's not completely stripped and not completely removed. And the idea is still somewhat enclosed and manifest the devush dak in a subtle form in levush hasaga. It's not quite as it was in stage one, when the dominant element was understanding it through our garments, through our handles, but it's still somewhat connected to a levush, what he calls a levush dak, a subtle garment, levush hasaga. Even after the stripping or the shedding and the negating from the image that was comprehended on the level where you were understanding it through something you can relate to, he still nevertheless understands and feels it. There still has some grasp in that imagery. So yes, we've moved to a higher level, but to say it's completely negate, that we don't have any connection to that original image, you cannot say. And the reason is obvious, because we're human beings, and though we may not need that example anymore, and we've been able to abstract it from any of the more structured imagery, there's still something that remains. In the parentheses, he says, because in truth, it's not possible to grasp and to understand a divine concept without any garment. There always has to be something. And I think yesterday someone mentioned it when we were speaking, that you always need to have something. So in Ayin Beis, he doesn't bring this level because maybe later he will, but I don't think he doesn't bring it here because he's like, sometimes it's not relevant to the flow in Ayin Beis. But if you want the full picture, that's why the Kuntres Aveda is giving us more of the details. So he includes this detail. Okay. So now, so this comprehension, even though, yes, it's called Pnimius HaMeichin, not Chitzenius, the inner cognitive, Yesh le'shayches al midas. It has a relationship with the midas. And remember, midas means here not just emotions, it means our relationship with us, who's understanding the idea. It has some relationship with the midas. Hainu, el hachush hamidas b'bchinas ispalus umurgish ksas. And he spells it out. It has a relationship with the chush hamidas, with the sense of emotions that have some ispalus umurgish, some ksas. Before he broke this down, he said that the midas come automatically and we're completely absorbed and they're like midas sichlim. But now as he's breaking down the levels, he says, in this state, there's still ispalus umurgish ksas, there's something still sensed. Not as much as the tangibility of the feelings in Chetzenis HaMeichin, but nevertheless, you can't say you completely left and exited that world of Hispilus HaMurgish. So in essence, really, it makes total sense because we don't just jump from one level to the next. Just as you talk about first experiencing it on our terms, and then understanding from our terms godliness. Now we're getting deeper and deeper. It's not just a leap from midas to meichin, it goes step by step. So he's saying this step is an in-between step where you've moved from chsenis meichin to primis meichin, but you can't say we've moved entirely away from midas as sensed midas, meaning felt and discernible midas. Okay. This is regarding the seichel. The seichel still has a relationship with the midas, and the same thing with the midas themselves. Even though in Pnimis HaMeichin we said the midas do not come through, doesn't need an exerted effort. because once a person is so absorbed in the divine experience, the midas naturally come from that. So mekol mokim, ein ze sha'er meir belev k'moy b'moyach. It's still that the it's not that the light, the energy, radiates in the heart exactly like it is in the mind. Even though on the top of the page he said that. There's bonus. What did he say? I'm just looking at the Lashon. He said. Oh, yeah. On page 7, he said the words. He said, I want to just compare the language. 1 second. Gemela. It was the language he expressed. He said a term that the lev becomes like the moyach. Oh yeah, shagam amidus in kamaya moichin. Okay. So point being that even also mitzad the midas to say they're not exactly the meir belev kamay b'moich ki'im mashalev margish esa'er. What's happening here is that the emotions are experiencing, are sensing the experience, the oir, the energy, v'agili shebemeach, and the revelation in the mind, because the mind is so absorbed in this divine experience. V'nimshach acher hamoyach, and it follows, is drawn, and follows the moyach. In chitzenes hameichin, the mind guides the emotions, but the emotions are the dominant element of what it means to my subjective reality. Here, the midas are not quite on the level of moyach completely, but they're feeling it and they're drawn toward the level of that level of moyach. So in this stage now, so you can't say the midas have really developed and matured to their highest point. Liyas b'chinas dveikus mamish, to say they're mamish, that the person's feelings and emotions are mamish connected and attached to the godliness through the mind. Because the air is not radiating them mamish literally, the fullest sense of the word. Rak mashenirgish. The emotions are feeling this higher state of consciousness. So therefore the emotions still have some ispilus, meaning some discernible, some tangible excitement. But how they've changed from the level of chitzenis hamechin, that they become something comparable to some extent to the level of mechin. Meaning closer to the true nature of what the mind is about when it experiences the divine in the fullest sense of the word. And one could say that this is how Ruach, you could say how Murgash is elevating and encompassed in the level of Neshomo. Remember here, Ruach and Neshomo is the equivalent of Murgash and Muskel, or Chagas and Chabad. That the level of Ruach is comparable to some extent, somewhat, to the level of Neshomo. Now, in the next paragraph, he's going to explain what is Pnimis HaMeichin in the fullest sense of the word. So this paragraph added a level, as I said, in Ayin Beis, doesn't speak about this level, but this is like a level in between Chitzenius HaMeichin and Pnimis HaMeichin. This is Pnimis HaMeichin. We're still not, the Meichin is not completely taken over. The midas still have some of what there was there before. There's still their nature of emotional experience, as we understood it on the level that like was on the earlier level, but now it's elevated to a higher level of moich. Okay, so I'll stop here if anybody wants me to clarify anything here. And now he's going to go to the highest level, and we'll do one more paragraph, and then we're going to go back to Ayin Beis. Okay. Omnom, next paragraph in Kuntres, the bottom of page 8. Omnom mi shehu b'madregas neshama. However, someone who's on the level of neshama, not ruach, as it's elevating to neshama, but someone on the level of neshama, hu sheyeshle be'etzem chush belikus. This is someone who has fundamentally a chush, a sense in godliness. And he grasps and understands and comprehends a divine idea, a divine level, the way it is as it is in its core place, without any garments of comprehension. Before we learned there's levush hasaga, then even when you remove the garments, there's still something, some of that imagery still remains. Now we're talking about a person who's on the level of neshama, that he has a chush without levush hasaga. And he immediately qualifies. Don't think I'm talking about something that is higher than Simpson. It's still coming down on a level that relates to the person, because we're talking about a human being here. We're not talking about someone that is going beyond the divine, that beyond any type of concealment. He says, so this is also a level of divine level of energy, or divine light, as it comes in the state of tzimtzum, of concealment. Kedei sheyuchlu sichlim nivroim lekabel mehem chabad leidus Hashem ulahavnu lahasig. Because in order for sichlim nivroim, the mind of creatures, to receive chabad, to know and to understand and to comprehend godliness, so there's only one way. A human being, even the highest level, needs it to come into a state through a concealment. So in other words, it's not the etzem eliki, it's the etzem eliki as a mind can comprehend. L'kamlim chabad, k'meshikosu b'sefer shabein perek lametes, like it explains in Tanya chapter 39, correct? He talks there about the Neshomo of tzaddikim, who have tchila v'rechima sichlim, which means they're connected through their minds to the core of the very core of but it's still through seichel. We're not saying we moved beyond seichel. We're saying we moved beyond subjective emotions, but we haven't moved beyond seichel. Even though it comes into understanding in a state of comprehension, but it's in the etzem inyan of godliness, not through garments, on our terms. So it's like understanding the spheres of Atzilus on their terms, but it's still spheres. There's still a structure. Whereas in Bri, Yitzir Asiya, that structure is also taking on garments and examples that we can relate to. So this needs to be explained. What does it mean to understand an inyan eliki, etzem in eliki, but it's still after the tzimtzum, in contrast to the levushim that come afterwards. In Perek Lametes in Tanya, when he speaks about this, is what he talks about: the tchila v'rechim sichlim and tivim. That there is that what we discussed right now is pure sichlim, but there's also lower levels, even by tzaddikim. When you go to not neshama, ruach and nefesh, and by all neshamas, then you're talking about the more the natural love that the neshama has to godliness, not something that's coming through a deep comprehension and relationship that's coming on that level of understanding the godliness itself. It's the natural, and therefore also on a level that is more midas oriented, more subjective. And by this person, by this individual is on the level of Neshama, the the divine energy or light, radiates by him. Begili mamish, mamish in a revealed way, b'moiche, in his mind, b'efen shu l'mayla, mebchinas hamidus, in a way that's higher than emotions, mitzad ha'er v'agili shabazeh. Due to the er and gili that he's experiencing is beyond any application, any emotional experience, any subjectivity. And subjectivity, I don't mean here in a bad way. I mean, it's not about relating to a particular individual's needs. It's about the experience itself. And this air radiates in the heart as well. And he gets awakened and stimulated also in his heart with a wondrous, with an amazing, with an extraordinary love and yearning. But now it's not in a state of ispalus amurgish, meaning there's nothing that you can point to that you see some excitability or sensation or feeling. It's very silent. Page 9 of Kuntres Aveda. Ki'im rather mashanimshach v'nidbak ma'oid belakus. Complete absorption and being drawn to and absorbed v'nidbak and attached and cleaved, very much so be'elakus in godliness. It's the example I gave the other day of someone who's who's experiencing a natural wonder, or listening to music, or reading a book, and they don't feel anything. They're so absorbed in it. Well, I should say they feel everything, but they don't feel it in any distinct, in any discernible, as I said, a sense with the senses. You're just so absorbed, the object and subject have become one. For who begins godless hamidus? Now he says shemishtanim el hamechin, and this is the full maturity of emotions, their highest level. Shemishtanim, not mishtavim. Before he said mishtavim, that they compare. Now he says mishtanim el hamechin, that they now change in a way that their type of experience is not an emotional experience. It's the mind experiencing something beyond the individual. Like I explained, moichin is not just cognitive and intellectual, but it's experiencing something beyond yourself. Midas on their own experience themselves, even the very refined emotions. That's what emotions are. There's some feeling, there's something. But now the midas have become completely absorbed in this level of moichin. And now he's going to talk here. One of the implications or consequences of this is the bittul that it causes. Remember that we talked about bittul hayesh. Earlier we talked about that when you're in the level of midas, there's a bittul hayesh. That was on page 6. And the chetzeni samechin, it leads to bittul hayesh. So now he's going to say, so what level of bittul does this lead to? It's not just the yesh that you exist, like he said back there. I'm just reading on that page. He said bittul hayesh. Bittul bezel bittul shemchinis hamidas, then a bittul hayesh loy habittul demoichin shalaman b'chinis bittul hayesh levad. So now he's going to say, what is the bittul? He says, ima yez the klolos habittul debiyah. Because remember, Neshomo is also the level of Bria. I know I mentioned before Atzilus. I want to correct myself. In Tanya and Lamed Perek Lamed Tes, he says this is the level of Bria. The emotional state that's like sichlim. So he says now, even though the general bitl of Bria Yitzir Asir Biyah, who b'chinas bitla yesh levad, meaning there's a yesh, there's an existing ego or entity, and it's nullified and subjugated to something higher. So the bittul of the lower levels of Ruach, they're also dedicated and directed toward godliness. Remember, Chetzenis HaMeichin is directing your emotions toward God, but it's emotions that are your emotions, your feelings, you're valuing, you're seeing God's value. Even higher than the value for you, that is your life and sustenance, and he's your father. But even the next level, which we call that murgish mitzad murgish. But even murgish mitzad aseichel, meaning Chetzenis HaMeichin, like he's saying here, there too, you're valuing godliness. So it's a bit layesh. By Neshomo, however, he says the bitl is in a form of dveikus. Because it's in a form of attaching and being absorbed and connected to the divine, and a form of deeper unity, yichud yeser, greater unification, and not ispilus umurgish, like we said. In other words, there's not another separate entity that's feeling something, or feeling, even appreciating the value of it, but is being absorbed in it. So therefore, it's a higher level in bittul. Now. In contrast, Ruach, even the higher level of Ruach, that is drawn to Neshomo, like we learned in the previous paragraph. We learned that it has some feeling, some sensation. So now he's going back, he's just reviewing all the levels. That too was only murgish ktsas, because it wasn't chetzenis hameichin. That was pnimius hameichin, but the level in between, where you still have some sense of feeling and sensation, some garment, some imagery. So basically 3 levels here. There's ruach as it becomes closer to neshama, and there's neshama. So he said the ruach he's going to talk about now is a complete hergish and his powers. You're excited. I'm excited about godliness, about God's value. I'm in awe of it. I'm in love with it. But it's a very strong sense, like he's going to say. Then there's murgish ksas. You feel something as you're climbing. And then finally, there's no hergish at all. So now he's comparing all of them. So he's saying the Shama, even though all biyah, bri, yitzir, and asiyah, which, by the way, is also neshama, ruach, and nefesh, or meichin, nika, and ibur, or muskel, murgish, and mutva. So he says like this, that the gamzeh, level 2, is also not like level 1. In chitzenis hameichin, shu b'chinas rash, murgish mamish. There's rash, there's actual a noise. Rash means noise, but rash means there's a strong sensation, and it's very much sensed, the emotional experience. So we have a very strong emotional experience. You have a somewhat emotional, which is pnimius hameichin, as ruach becomes similar, closer to neshama, and there's neshama where there's no rash at all. So he's going to explain this now with an example. V'yashleimer, the kamosh elam abriya. To explain this, how do you explain the fact bria tzira? See, they're all yesh, because bria means bria yesh ma'ayin. Atzilus is a state of ayin, complete, no sense of self altogether. Here we're talking about a human being, yes, a very high level, who's using their mind, but their mind is completely absorbed with godliness. So the Rebbe Rashab is now going to explain the difference between bria, tzir, and asiyah, basically. He says like this: V'yesh leimer, the kamosha elam abriya eina b'chinas yesh adayim, ki'im b'chinas of shari hametzias. Okay, in volume 2, much earlier in volume 2, we learned about this actually relatively at length. So let me explain. In the process of creation, everything is done in a very logical and progressive, step-by-step fashion. Because as I've explained many times, the whole point of Ishtalshalus is not just that God exists and that God's beyond us all, but that we should have a relationship, we should understand. So God created existence in a structured way, which you can compare, which from there evolves the structures that we have. Atzilus, for right now, we'll call it the world of vision, the divine vision of existence. In building a structure, you have to have a unified vision. So it's not yet even a yesh. You haven't even built an outline yet. The next step is an outline. Is an outline, like a skeleton. Yetzira is giving it shape and form, and Asiya is the final product. I spoke about this. I gave a 4-part course a few months ago on this, how Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya can help us in every possible way in our lives, whether it's business, personal relationships, because everything needs these 4 steps to be a complete product. When it's explained in Chassidus, it explains that Bria, you can't call it complete vision, the divine vision, or the divine vision within Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. On the other hand, because it's only an outline, you can't call it a full yesh either. So the expression used in Chassidus is called Afshari HaMetzias. It's not full Metzias, it's not non-Metzias, so you call it Afshari HaMetzias, the possibility for something to exist. But it really means it's like the difference between the moment before conception of a child and the moment when the seed is fertilized by the egg is fertilized by the seed and something was conceived. So the stage before Hashem planned, and he's already has a soul ready to send down to this and this body. But you can't say life, or let's put it this way, physical life has begun at all. Once conception happens, you now have something to hold on to. The Neshomo can now be placed inside this one cell. But can you call it a Metzias of a child? No. So you call it Efshari HaMetzias, meaning it's now a viable reality, but it's not a full Metzias yet. That's one of the ways to explain Efshari HaMetzias. So he says, so even though Bria, something has happened, he says, so it's not a yesh. You can't call it a yesh. You can't call it ayin, but you can't call it a yesh adayin. It's like some place between ayin and yesh, like where the seed is planted, but it hasn't yet sprouted. Meaning only that it allows space for yesh. The very possibility of a yesh is possible now. That's what Bria creates. In Atzilus, you don't have the possibility of a yesh yet, because it's completely divine.
So it's not the seed. A seed is not a Neisen Mokim. A seed is already something.
I gave an example, just to give an example for us to be able to relate. I'm not going to say the example is perfect. Yetzira has now become a defined yesh, in contrast to Bria. So sometimes the example given is like when you take a raw piece of clay. If you don't have clay altogether or any material, you can't shape it into anything. So Bria would be, at least you have something, but it doesn't yet have shape and form, so you can't call it a full-bodied entity. Now, obviously, we're not talking in Gashmis here, because not Bria and not Yitzir, they're both not physical. We're talking in the context, in relation to something that is complete bittul, completely divine, like Atzilus. Now, remember, Atzilus also has spheres. But this brings me back to what I've said a number of times. For us, even envisioning one state of spiritual state is already Asiyah Ruchnius. Here we're talking about Yitzira, Bria, Atzilus. So this requires somewhat of abstraction, or else it's just words. That's why I'm giving examples. Like we said, you need here Levushe Hasoga. If you ever need Levushe Hasoga, you need it here, because we cannot understand Bria and Yitzira on their own without examples. Because both of them are spiritual states. So what's the difference between the two? That's why I'm giving examples from things that we relate to. Now, I immediately qualified that these examples are not perfect. Because at the end of the day, even a seed, like you just said, or even the concept, there's something physical there. But compared to what the child will be later, you can call it Efshari HaMetzias. As a matter of fact, even in halacha, a child is not considered a viable entity until after 30 days because the child is still very fragile. So I'm not going to say that nothing exists. We can't say there's no Metzias there. But relatively speaking, it's all relative, obviously. In the context of you want to have a spiritual example, it's a little harder, but I'll give you an example. In Tafresh Nun, the Rebbe Rashab, to help us envision a little spirituality, gives the example like this. Imagine seeing an apple, you're holding an apple in your hand, you see it, you can taste it, the colors, you could smell it, all the senses experience it. That's a physical apple. You study it, then close your eyes and imagine the apple that you just saw. So in your mind now, you can envision every detail, especially if you really memorized it and studied it well. You could even envision every drop of moisture on the peel of the apple. You could even envision what it would taste like. But it's all in an envisioned state. You can't say in your mind there's a real apple. Somewhat another example would be digitalizing content. If you take words and you scan it on a page, and the scanner now you see it in the computer. So tangible physical letters that you were able to touch, that were made from ink, are now become an image that look exactly the same. And then when you go into the understanding computer language, it goes all the way back to zeros and ones, combined in different ways, create all these different images and letters and everything that we experience all the time. So you have the digital version, you have the physical version. Just examples to show you that you can use technology today to explain at more abstract levels. Now, if you could go back 4 steps, you'd go back to Atzilus, where it's all in God's mind. But it's not in God's mind like before the Tzimtzum, because Atzilus is an actual reality. It's an actual reality, but it's a reality that is completely the divine chesed, divine gvura, divine teferes. In Bria, chesed begins to get some substance. Now, what is substance? Not as we understand substance like a physical container, but it's beginning to become shaped into something that we can identify with more. So that's why we call it, on one hand, yesh, but not yesh mamish. Efshar yametzis. In Yetzirah, is beginning to have even more form and shape. In Asiya, even more so. And Asiya Gashmias is the physical reality as we experience it. So the challenge is for us, how many levels can you abstract to really be able to appreciate these levels in a way that you really understand it, not just words. In other words, could you write a paper right now or make a presentation to explain to me how an apple exists on 4 levels? Atzilus level, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. It's not so easy because we're not used to spiritual thinking. We could definitely explain, like I just did, physical compared to digital, or physical compared to something more ethereal, like almost metaphorical. But to go through 4 levels is not so simple. So this is really, in the beginning, this sounds just like words. But the fact is that the more you study it, the more you can come to relate. Because going back to the example of the apple, now imagine the next level. Your mind envisions the apple. What about a level before the mind that envisions the envisioning of the apple? See, in other words, if you go onto the level of the neurons, or even deeper, you're no longer envisioning an apple, but you're envisioning the envisioning of the apple. So essentially, this is real abstractions of understanding higher levels of ethereal or spirituality. But regarding what we're discussing here, let's bring it back more to a practical level. The question is, when you experience godliness, are you experiencing God on God's terms or on your terms? Now, we all begin on our terms. Even up here, it actually says that a person always begins by serving and doing Torah mitzvah shalei l'shma with ulterior motives. But there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way we were created. You tell a child, here, I'll give you a candy if you study. An adult, other type of reward. You feel it's rewarding, fulfilling. So the idea is to move from, we spoke about, from a self-interest life to a God, from an egocentric life to a God-centric life. But it's still because God is my father. God is my sustenance. So obviously, I love and want to love and connect with him. Then you come to the next point. That would be like nefesh. We call that mutfeh. This is behavioral. It has some isbananus because you're at least contemplating to know that this is your father, this is your sustenance. Then you come to the next level, murgish, where you have a natural feeling. The feeling is coming and you really feel it, not just on a behavioral level. Then you come to the level, and that also has some mind, the mind helps as well. Then you come to chetzeni samechin. It's still a murgish where you are now contemplating on the value of God, not because he sustains you. You start contemplating, look at existence. And existence is all nullified before God. So you start appreciating godliness, but through the lens of existence. You have something to hold on to. Like we said, levusha asogim. And that brings to midas, very tangible. You feel the midas, you feel a passionate being drawn to and longing and connecting to godliness. But it's still you experiencing it. The next level, what he called here, primis hameichin, but it's still ruach as it relates to neshama. He said, so now you don't have, you're stripping it from these garments, but you still have something. Like I said with the apple, it's almost impossible to imagine an apple in a pure spiritual state without something that that speaks to us. Because then the day we began on a physical level, and we began through identifying things through levush hasaga, like he said, you have some levush dak, a very subtle garment, but there's still some garment. And the midas too are still are sensed and felt. In other words, you're feeling the experience. But he says, Mishu b'madregas neshama, on the other hand. Now you come to the level of bria, higher than Yitzira, which is what I just described. Yitzira and bria are neshama, and Yitzira is ruach, and bria is neshama. When you come to pure bria, now you're talking about a person, like he says, Yeshli be'etzem chush belakus. He just relates directly his senses of godliness. Yes, it's his mind, and there's a human being there. So he's in the level of bria, but this is a level of that's the highest possible level that a human being can reach before we go into Atzilus, which is already a whole other dimension. We're not addressing right now. So the highest level he can reach, and that's what he says. He says, even though in general it's bitla yesh, I'm using, but it's in a state of dveikus and yichud yeser. Mashenken ruach, which is murgish ksas. And nefesh, even, or ruach on its own, which is rash umurgish mamish. So just like elim abriya is not a full yesh, this neshama, this level of neshama is like this level of bria, she'en mokum liyesh. That only gives a nascent mokum liyesh. Al v'yitzira b'chinas yesh. Kamoy Kain, he now says, who are hefresh ba'abitl shalahem. Same thing is similar as the difference in their bitl. The bitl the neshama who loy b'chinas yeshu murgish. The bitl of the level of the neshama, the moichin, the primis hamoichin, absorbed in godliness, is not yeshu murgish. It's not felt and sensed by the person, like I said. You're completely absorbed. Rakshanation mokum liyesh b'zeh. I'm sorry, Rakshanation mokum liyesh. It only gives room for a yesh, which means it's not, why? Because she'ena b'chinas bittul mitzias mamish, k'mei b'chinas yichudi Allah. Because it's not complete bittul mitzias. You can't say the person no longer exists. In yichudi Allah, you don't even talk about an individual altogether. It's completely godliness. Here you're talking about an individual, so therefore, is he a yesh or is he not? So he calls it nesinas makom liyesh. So like when you say the Rebbe a neshama beguf, I'm not talking now as a Rebbe in the level of Atzilus. Moshe Rabbeinu a neshama beguf. You see him, he walks and talks, even on the level of neshama. We're not talking now again higher levels. On the level of neshama, you can't say he doesn't exist. He's an existing entity. And he looks like us. He relates to us. We can speak to him and so on. The Jews spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe spoke to them. They were able to see him and experience him. So you can't say there's no, so we call it Nesinus Mokum Liyesh. The fact that he manifests in a body means he's giving room and he relates to existence of a yesh, even though he himself is not in the state of this yesh. So that's what he calls the ultimate bitla yesh. Okay, that's bria, that's neshama.
Moshe Rabbeinu is yes.
No, I'm not. No. There's no stopping now. I need to continue because people are going to get confused. So let me continue, and then you'll ask any question. By contrast, the bitl, the nullification of ruach, is yesh and murgish. It's an entity. It feels itself. It has subjective interests. It's directed toward godliness. And it's now loving God instead of loving its own needs. But you can't call it, but it's a yesh and murgish. V'zeh inyan bitl hayesh, and that's bitl hayesh, the yesh hamizbatl hu barash v'yispilus. And he's going to explain, this yesh hamizbatl, this yesh of Yetzirah that is nullifying itself, is with rash, it's with noise and with excitement. U'kamay eitzim hanisrafim, like burning wood. Shehin berash. When you burn wood, it's not completely silent. It's not like, let's say, Kuntres incense. It makes noise. Why? Why is it making noise? Because there's something there that's burning. A bitl that's higher than that is not something that's burning. It's completely absorbed in the experience. And also in its bitl, not only that it's a yesh that's burning, but it's also in the bitl itself, it's in a state of yesh. The bitl itself is also felt. And all of this is one inyan, meaning the bitl of the yesh, that it's experiencing something, and that the bitl itself is an experience that has sense, sensation. That's all the level of Yetzirah, Ruach. Okay. Now I shall stop, and you could ask any question. Neshomo, on the other hand, like he just said, he would call this higher than this level of bitl yesh. It's more like bitl of the Efshari HaMetzias of the world of Bria. So something exists, but it's completely absorbed in the source. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not so clear about the example that you brought from Moshe Rabbeinu, that this is a nesinas mokim. Moshe Rabbeinu, Neshomo beguf, it's l'chora yesh, no?
You compare the guf of a Moshe Rabbeinu to the regular people?
No, because we could see.
But he's not a yesh. He's only relating. It's like when the Malachim came down to earth, to Avram Avinu, they ate and drank because that's the custom, not because they fundamentally eat and drink. So Moshe Rabbeinu, and like every tzaddik on that level, is involved in this world, but they're not made of this world. So that's how I would explain. I mean, it's just, again, an example. If you have a better example. Okay, any other question? Anybody wants to ask anything? The truth is, I'm going to stop here. The parentheses, I mean, of course, it helps understand things, but I'm not going to read the parentheses. You can read it on your own if you want.
This is fascinating stuff.
That's what Chassidus is.
It's interesting. In the context of reading this essay, this Kuntres, you talked about both Chisonius Amochin and Pnimius Amochin, and when you talked about Chisonius Amochin, you it seemed like you were saying that's mitzad morgash. Maybe it's muskel sheba morgash, but still morgash. And yet it's. I mean, I'm just talking about the terms themselves. It's mochin. You think of as an intellectual level, but you're saying no. It has primarily manifests as in some emotional way. Is that correct?
I don't know which level you're talking about now.
Chitzonius hamochin.
He said it explicitly.
Yeah.
Chitzonius hamochin shayach al hamidus. He said it in Ayin Beis and explained here.
Uh-huh.
Just for the record,
Pneumis
Pnimis hamochin is also express itself in midas. However, the midas are not murgish; they're midas sichlim, is what he called. So everything is here going to affect the midas. The question is how it's affecting. It all comes down to, as I said, very simply put, we begin as subjective creatures, completely emotional. We grow and mature. Maturity means that you keep your emotions and your subjective impulses and reflexes and whims you tame them. As you grow in different ways, you're both seasoning and harnessing the emotional experience. You're also growing to the point where you're becoming and understand things on objective levels, to the point that the emotions become elevated to the level of the objectivity of the divine experience that the mind can lead one to. This is the steps. There's a lot of steps. The ones that we've mentioned are pretty much 3 general steps, but in the 3, there's overlap. So there's mutfa, murgish, muskel, nefesh, ruach, neshama. The nefesh has ruach in it, some midas in the behavioral. The midas have seichel in it, different levels. First, just to make you aware, recognition. Then the moyach chitzeni samechin, where you contemplate more, but it still relates to you and your emotions. And pnimis samechin, where it's not about you; it's experiencing the divine as it is, not in the garments that you relate to. That's the brief context of these levels. But I'm ready to go back to the Ayin Beis. There's enough with the Kuntres Aveda. 10:30 ready anyway. But bottom line is that's what the Rebbe Rashab says. Pnimis Hamechin depends which level. There's 2 levels in Pnimis Hamechin. Mishtanim is pure neshama. The paragraph before is Mishtavim El Hamechin. That's Ruach, as he calls. If you look at the page, he says, Yashlem Ruach ha'elav v'nichlol b'madregas neshama. As I said, there's overlap. It's never. Remember, think about a human being. We don't jump from behavioral to emotional to cognitive. It's a slow process. Every child, every one of us. First is a little more seichel, a little more seichel, a little more midas. Everything is like a tree. Does it grow overnight? Every second it's growing. The human being is like Eitz Asada, which is like the emotional growth and the intellectual growth. That's a constant process. Where you stand, we now have a formula. You want an algorithm that can help define where you stand. And also remember, there are people who, the same moment, we can be in several stages in the same moment. You can be very immature, and a moment later you can become very mature. You know, we fluctuate, but there's a general progression in growth. And I think the best thing in these type of situations is to find examples in your own life. Are you reacting emotionally, subjectively? Are you reflecting? Are you allowing your mind to guide your emotions, your heart? You know, we all can evaluate ourselves with this context. Now, it's not so easy to do because when you're in an emotional state, it's hard to evaluate yourself. But nevertheless, if you step aside for a moment, in a moment when you can reflect, you can say, okay, where do I stand? How do I react to things? And it's not that difficult to identify. You know, you see it all the time. You can see how you can see the difference between someone with gadlus hamechin and katnus hamechin, or gadlus hamidus and katnus hamidnus. But there's also, as I said, many, many levels. It's not just black and white, either one or the other. It's all different levels of progression. In Avedas Hashem, he made it clear. It's how you experience godliness is the ultimate test of how you experience yourself in the context of godliness. Now, Yechudi Ilah and Atzilus, which would be beyond Neshomo, that would already be Yechida, Chaya and Yechida, are higher levels. That is not got into at all yet. So that's not being discussed, at least not for now. Now we're talking all on the levels of the emotional growth of a person, a human being. If you remember the beginning of this subject, he said that all this is about having three levels. On page 1221, when he started the topic, he said these words. Just like the body divides between Reish, Guf, Regel, the head, the body, and the legs, there's Chabad Chagas Nehi in Midas. And he began discussing that. And then he said, so it's all about a Midas, but it's in Midas itself. We've now learned a bunch of levels of how these Midas develop. Gimel Madregas, Gimel Mutva, Murgish, Umusko. So on page 1223, it said, Hakol hu ba'amidas, rakshazo hagdolas amidas, begimel madregas, ibur unika meichin. And then he goes on to speak about the natural and the emotional and the natural behavioral. When they're still concealed, when they become revealed, and when they develop and grow. Okay?
It's interesting.
And then again, one second. Then again, on page 1225, he said, the Let me ask you something. Do any of you ever go back and read the text, or you just go along with me as we're learning it here? Because I can tell you, I constantly go back. I constantly go back and refer, because to really keep it clear in your mind, you really have to see all these ideas. So I strongly recommend that. I mean, you can rely on me, but you're not going to get it yourself if you don't really go back on all the texts and like see how he got here. But just a suggestion.
In page 1223, saying Hamido is eno mishtanim be'etzem mahusom. We're saying that in Gadlus Hamidas, mishtanim ala moichim, but it's probably
we haven't finished the subject. That's why. In page 1231, he's going to talk about this. There's going to be a stage where the midas change as well. He just didn't get to that yet. I think the Kuntres Aveda that we learned, especially this highest level, we're soon going to learn in Ayin Beis in different language. So that's why I wanted to learn it. So right now, he spoke about that the midas have become sichli mamish, the end of paragraph on page 1230. But there's more to this subject. As I said, there's another 20 pages on this topic. So it's far from over. At the end of the day, I think Ayin Beis is going to be more elaborate than Kuntres Aveda. I just wanted to learn the Kuntres Aveda because it just helps understand some points here.
That was amazing.
Which part?
That you brought in the Kuntres Aveda.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
What year was Kuntres Aveda done?
1909 and 1910.
Thank you.
As I said, there's also the Maimorim in Eter, that same year, 1910, where it's also discussed pretty much at length as well. I'm middle of learning it, so I don't want to yet jump anything, but a lot of these ideas are discussed in detail there. So we'll get back to that. Okay, If there are no questions, we'll stop here. So we finished the Kuntres Aveda page. I went to page 9, right? Till the parentheses.
What's the mimer you're learning that goes into this in more detail?
Kuntres Aveda?
No. You said you're reading something else. You're
It's,
still
it's,
in the
more,
middle.
it's more than one mimer. It's Hemshech Eter, it's called. Tofrei Ayin. It's a whole Sefer Maimorim. It's a whole book. A lot of Maimorim that talk about it there. It's
And
called
that's by the
Eter.
Rebbe Rishab. Eter,
19
Aleph Taf Resh.
Ayin Tofresh. Like this is
Ayin.
Tofresh Ayin Beis, that's Tofresh Ayin. But you don't want to write Tofresh Ayin, so you write Eter, Ayin Tofresh.
Why do we not write Taf Resh Ayin?
Because of the word Ra, evil.
Oh, got it. And this is also the Rebbe Rishab?
Yeah. The Rebbe Rashab is everything from Tofresh Mem Gimel through Tofresh Pei. That was his leadership. His Nesius is from 1883 or 1882 even through 1920. So what we're learning now is Ayin Beis began 1912. Where we are now is more like 1916 or 17 even. And that there's a little before. Kuntres Aveda is also. Okay.
You know what is amazing? It shows that the Rebbe had everything in his mind before he started doing it. It's like all in his mind completely, and then just brought it down. To me, it's mind blowing.
It's even more amazing when you look in Tanya and you see how these ideas originate there. Then you see that all the Rabbeim had this picture that develops. And I didn't even go into the Mittler Rebbe, how the Mittler Rebbe talks about this. There's a lot more that we haven't even covered, but trying to get through it. But this is this is one example. This is a sugya, a discussion of about the development and maturity of a human being and the relationship with God. So Tanya, the Tanya chapter 16, 39, 38, 39, 40, 43, 44 are a lot of the basis of these ideas here. And yeah.
Mind blowing, Sheba, mind blowing.
So we're stopping here at the top of, okay.